got your book there, right, Mark?
Good morning. I'm so very glad you're here. My name is Sarah Menard, and I am the president of the Foundation for Restoration. And on behalf of the foundation, I welcome you to St. Genevieve and to this history conference. I'm quite certain you are in for a very enjoyable day. Thank you to Bob Mueller. He lined up a spectacular schedule of speakers for today. And the first one is Dr. Will Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a French professor and chair of the Department of World Languages and Literature at the University of Memphis. He teaches courses on French literature and civilization, as well as the French-speaking world. His current research focuses on the French heritage of the Old Mines community in Missouri, and he maintains a website and edits a newsletter devoted to this topic. He currently serves as a board member and vice president for the Center for French Colonial Studies. And in 2009, he was named a Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques. He previously presented outside portrayals of the Old Mines French Creole community at the 2016 Joint History Conference. So please welcome Dr. Will Thompson, who will present on the Old Mines St. Genevieve connection.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bob, for inviting me to speak this year. Just to a little preface to my presentation. I realize it's very dangerous coming to this event and talking about St. Genevieve and Old Mines, because most of the people here are either from St. Genevieve or Old Mines, and just don't nod too disapprovingly when I say things that you may not agree with. Also, I apologize in advance. People last night at the reception were saying, oh, you're going to talk about Old Mines, so you're going to talk about Papa French? I said, no. And he said, well, we're at the Jesuit Valley house. Are you going to talk about his mining operations? No. So if I don't touch on some aspect of the Old Mines St. Genevieve connection that you're expecting, maybe I'll come back in a couple years and do part 2. So what I do want to talk about, though, are the ties that bind between these communities. And these are geographical, historical, the mining, of course, and other business operations, land and land grants and land claims, religion, and of course, family. But I will not be going too deep into genealogy because that is a bottomless pit in which one can plunge, and Cece Myers is here and she would nod disapprovingly if I said something wrong. So, make sure I'm going the right way here. There we go. Just a short geography lesson in case you are not aware. So, there is St. Louis. We are here, and Old Mines is directly west of here. You can't get there now by going directly west. You have to go a little bit south or north, but it is about an hour away. If we go back to the 18th century, here's another map, and you can see at the bottom where it says Pays des Osages, the land of the Osage, you will see this area, and it says tout ce canton est plein de mines. This whole area is full of mines. And so that when we talk about old mines, we're talking about very old mines indeed. There we go. And just one last map. This is the Old Mines Concession, which dates from the end of the 18th century. And I'll be talking about that in a little bit, but I just love to include this map because it is such a fascinating part of the period and the history of Old Mines, and with some connection to St. Genevieve. So when trying to figure out what am I going to talk about, because this is, if you get me talking about old mines and St. Genevieve, that's nobody else would get to speak at the conference because there's so much that can be said. But I thought I'd focus on some major figures that probably are familiar to you if you've read much about the history of this region, and use these figures as examples of the connection between the two communities and their history and their people. So I'm going to start, how far back does this go? Well, the connection predates the existence of either St. Genevieve or Old Mines. We can go back in 1700, Le Père Gravier, Father Gravier, in basically a journal that he kept, these are known as the Jesuit Relations, were sent back by the priest to say, hey, this is what I'm doing. And in 1700, he writes that he is with a group that is going down the Mississippi, and they discover the Merrimack, which he had a very interesting spelling for that, the Mia Migoa, and he refers to a lead mine up the Merrimack, where the ore yields 3/4 metal, meaning that they had already determined the quality of the lead there, meaning there was already some kind of, perhaps not what we would call commercial mining, but at least the French were already in the area and already figuring out what they were going to do, since they weren't finding, as a few people have been discussing even this morning, they weren't finding silver and gold and precious metals, but lead was pretty useful in the 18th century, and it was worth exploiting. So when do we really have the first history relating to old mines, which predates St. Genevieve? And for that, we have to go to this guy. This is a caricature of Philippe Francois Renaud. And anybody who has been to old mines or read about old mines know this name, because this is the individual who had the first grant to engage in mining operations in what is now old mines. And there's he's been mentioned many, many times, lots of really incorrect information provided about him. I've been very fortunate to connect with a now retired history professor in the north of France, who actually is from the town that Philippe Francois Renaud was from, and he's given me some information and corrected some information. So Renaud, from the Picardy region of France, comes to this region, to the Illinois country, in 1720, and 3 years later, and this is a date that if you go to old mines you will see signs referring to 1723, he receives a grant to conduct mining operations in both the old mines area and also Mine-la-Motte, and he also has some land grants on the other side of the river. And it's an interesting text. First of all, nobody can figure out exactly where this is because the description is so, it's just, you can't figure out where it is. We know it's up the Merrimack, and then you take a left somewhere. But what's fascinating is that you go up the Merrimack and you go up the first fork, which we think is probably the big river, and that leads to the cabins called the Cabinage de Renaudière. So he's getting a land grant, but there's already a community there. There's already something going on there. Remember, he's arrived in 1720, and 3 years later he gets the grant. But he's not been just sitting around saying, well, what am I going to do? He's been very busy, and he's not the first person doing mining there. There's already a mining camp, and cabinage is a problematic word because it means sort of a hut. So I guess it's slightly subjective. Was this just like they put up some lean-tos, or did they actually build some kind of cabins? Who knows? But anyway, there was mining operation in this area before Renaud got his grant. Renaud just kind of made it official. And you can see his name is spelled different ways. I think R-E-N-A-U-T. Often the L is put in because that's the modern spelling, but spelling was kind of just however you wanted to do it, even in the 18th century. And then it also says where Sieur Renaud has his furnaces. So he's getting a grant for a place where he's already himself conducting mining operations and has built the primitive form of furnace that the French were using. And then straight to the place called the Great Mine. So there's already a mine there that's being exploited. And so this is all, again, 1720s that these mining operations are taking place. There is some kind of temporary community because from everything that I've read and other people can probably share, I know Carl Eckbert has written about this, they did not live full time at the mines, although there are some references that suggest perhaps otherwise. They were coming over from Fort de Chartres and Saint-Philippe, which is where Renaud had established his little community with the people he brought over with him from France and from Kaskaskia. And this, again, thanks to my contact in France, this is the Renaud, where the Renaud family lived in Couzoul, which is in northeastern France, basically on the border with Belgium. And so that is the community where Renaud's family is buried as well. They are buried just outside the church there. But Renaud, even though he did return to France in the 1740s, having sometimes the impression you get from reading is that he came and the mining didn't work out very well and he left. Well, he was there for 22 years, so that's not an insubstantial period of time. And I'm going to have to go back and look through some Kaskaskia records and some St. Anne records because he came over with, he left a wife and 2 daughters in France. But he brought his son with him, who was, I think, a teenager at the time. Somewhere in the Kaskaskia records, and I'd have to go back, I've got the reference somewhere, it talks about Renaud and his sons. So I don't know what was going on there. We can guess, but there's very, we just don't have a lot of documentation about that. But he did definitely go back to France. We don't know if the men that came with him all went back. We know some stayed. But his legacy lives on with the Fourche Renaud Creek, which is redundant because the Fourche means like a fork, a creek. But the name is still there, very much so in the old mines community. And again, we were talking about 1742. We're still predating the formal founding of St. Genevieve. Jumping forward just a little bit, just after Renaud is leaving, we have, I have to thank Carl Eckbert, who wrote an article on Antoine Valentin de Gris, and he writes about the mines as he's describing the other phenomena that he is seeing in this region. And he talks about the mine appears to be very rich, although one might judge it by the many rich veins that are found. The main body of this mine has not been discovered because it is being worked by ignorant persons who have no power other than that of their arms. And then he later states, most of the miners who numbered 18 or 20 when I left the Illinois country were wastrels sent to this spot involuntarily for not having been able to support themselves. We know that there was probably slave labor. For those who had the means, they sent their slaves to work the mines, and those who did not have the means were the wastrels, I guess, and ignorant ones who did it on their own. But it's interesting that these, if they were in fact kind of maybe the black sheep of the family, or some guys who just showed up looking for fortune, that maybe they're marginal in the official record, and maybe they were spending a lot more time and lasting a lot longer in old mines than we officially know in the record. Jumping forward a little bit, so St. Genevieve exists, and it becomes very much a launching point for individuals engaging in mining. And if you know the history of mining in Washington County, you know that Moses Austin is a key figure. He comes from Virginia, having had mining operations there, comes with and establishes himself first in St. Genevieve, where he spends time before, as he is creating his mining operations at Mina Breton or Mina Berton in what is now Potosi. And he's a very fascinating figure. It's a very complicated story with Austin and the French miners. There's lots of documentation describing the land grants of the period, and there's a lot of conflicting information within these grants. And there was not a good relationship between Moses Austin and the French. He looked down on them, as De Gris did, because their mining operations were primitive. He didn't speak French, so obviously they weren't good because they spoke French. But it's fascinating to see that this is one of the real connections, because he is a very good example of how St. Genevieve is a key point for the mining operations after the 1760s, when it becomes a Spanish territory and then later American. And there we go. And this is, I believe, Moses Austin Outhouse 2. I've got that correct, or whatever. I know it's called that somewhere. And I believe his house in St. Genevieve, Bob, somebody here would know, it no longer exists. But he did, in fact, have a presence in St. Genevieve. He had business partners in St. Genevieve, the Valley family in particular. And so there's a very strong connection right there. And Austin is very important because he is, no matter what his relationship is with the French in the old mines area, he's providing us a lot of descriptions. He becomes considered the expert on the mines. And so we have quite, if you look in the American state papers, there's a lot of documentation about the land grants, and there's a lot of information about Austin. And since we have quite a crowd now, I'll read this. So he is asked to describe the mines in the area where he is living, and he says, "The time for working the mines is August to December. After harvest, the inhabitants of St. Genevieve and New Bourbon resort to the mines. The rich send their Negroes, and the poor class depend on the mines to furnish them with lead to purchase all important articles," as I mentioned earlier. From the middle of August to the 15th or 20th of December, there are from 40 to 50 men employed in digging mineral. The remainder of the year, but little mineral is drawn from the mines and but few hands employed. So this is interesting to me because it's saying, yeah, it's basically a fall occupation. That is when the majority of the lead is being extracted, but the rest of the year there are people there, and which I find quite fascinating. We do know that due to conflicts with Native Americans, that the mines were not necessarily a safe area. We know that Moses Austin and his employees were attacked, and the French didn't help them when they were attacked, and so that they're contributing to the bad blood. But Austin, when 1804, where are we? We're after the Louisiana Purchase. We are now American territory, and there's really a land grab. Everybody wants land, and everybody's realizing that the Spanish and the French never gave them grants that were going to be approved by the Americans. And so Austin continues, because Austin is writing this description of the mines, but at the same time, he wants the mines for himself. So he says, the French inhabitants of this country have followed the mining business upwards of 80 years, yet They have not advanced in the art of smelting a step beyond their ancestors. The methods they pursue bespeak their surprising ignorance. Sorry, those of you of French descent. These are your ancestors being described. But it shows that he's saying, hey, I'm the expert. And I've got the connections, because he was dealing with the Valley family, with others in St. Genevieve. And he's saying, hey, the French don't know what they're doing. I'm the expert. And, oops, sorry, went wrong direction. And he does describe old mines among the other mines in the area. And he says old mines, so called from being discovered many years before the Mina Berton, which is where he was living. It is said the old mines were opened and wrought by Monsieur Rannaud, so small spelling there, about the year 1726, just a few years off. At the time, he explored this country for the famous Lawn Company, not quite accurate. It is situated 5 miles northeast of the Mina Berton, more or less accurate, on the discovery of which it was abandoned, mineral being found in great abundance at the new mine. So the French did abandon to a great extent old mines to move a few miles south because that's where the employment was. The old mines remained in this situation until February 1802, when 15 French families made a settlement near the mines and have formed a village. That's a lie. It was probably several years earlier, but what Austin knew was that land grants were being, if it was mining country, then the government was going to have first claim. But if you were conducting agriculture and it could prove you had been there for many years or several years, then you could probably get a grant. So Austin's trying to give a semi-accurate portrayal, but he's also trying to say the French really aren't agriculture. They're not conducting an agriculture. They're not farmers, and they haven't been there that long, so they're not going to have a strong claim to the land, because he wanted the land. And I just recently came across this document. This was a rough drawing of what is now Potosi, done for, as you can perhaps see at the top, done for Moise's Austin. And what's interesting here is that right here, it's not very clear on the screen, but on the original, it's clearly the Chemin des Vieilles Mines, the road of the old mines. And I found that fascinating because it suggests that there was a road of some sort, well-defined path, I don't know exactly what, leading to the old mines. So there's if the old mines had been completely abandoned, why would you have a road to them? So just question marks that keep appearing as I look at these things more and more. And I think I've got, let's see, that was the last of Mr. Austin. But let's talk about somebody from St. Genevieve who also got involved with the old mines land claims, and that is Francois Valley, the Jr., the second, who had business dealings with Austin that, as from what I've read, did not, the Austin Valley relationship was not a long-lived or one and ended not so well. But what happened when the people at old mines, no matter what Austin said, finally said, hey, we have been here, this is a region our families have been for several years, and going back to perhaps the 1720s, even if it was not necessarily a continuous habitation for us, we've been here a long time, and we are a community, and we would like this land. It's not a huge amount of land, but it is our home. Please let us have this land. And that original petition was actually to the Spanish government in the late 18th century. Nothing ever happened with that, so when the Louisiana Purchase occurs and all of a sudden there's a new government in charge, the people say, hey, well, now it's really urgent because everybody's grasping for land. There are new laws about who can have the land with lead, and we've got all these English-speaking Americans coming in and invading our territory. We really need to act on this. And what's fascinating, and these are just the signatures, the signatories of the petition to have this grant, so this concession. I should stop saying grant because we refer to the Renault's grant as a grant. It is completely different from the Old Mines concession, which is what the inhabitants of Old Mines were asking for in the late 1790s, early 1800s. And here are the signatures, and if you know the names of Old Mines, and I'll mention some more of these shortly. You see Boyer or Boyer. You see the Robert or Robard. You see Hippolyte Robert, who is Robert Hippolyte. You see Veuve Coleman, the widow Coleman is there, the only woman listed. You see a Govero family, another Boyer, another Coleman, Duclos. Amable Partenay, that's a fascinating story for another time. So you're seeing the Old Mines families, and then you get down and you see Valley, another Valley, Francois Valley. I'm like, they were living at Old Mines? What's going on here? Well, what the connection between Old Mines and St. Genevieve was strong enough that somebody said, hey, the poor miners who are all probably illiterate anyway, you can see that they are all signing with their mark, sa marque. They're putting an X. They are not signing their names. They can't write a petition. They can't deal with the American government. They don't know how to say these, put everything nicely. We need some ringers. We need to bring in some people who say, hey, I want a claim too, and look at my last name. It's Valet. I'm important. I'm going to have some pull, and this is what worked. So apparently, and since we don't have the original petition that the people of Old Mines wrote, they kind of pushed a few families to the side and said, hey, you can live here, but you're not going to be on the petition. We're going to replace you with some people with more important names. So several of the petitioners were not living in Old Mines, they were not mining, and they were not, more importantly, cultivating any land, because you needed to be cultivating land. You couldn't say, I'm mining the land, because that did not get an individual a land concession. You had to prove that you were living there and conducting at least subsistence agriculture so that you could get the grant. And so we have these people who never lived in Old Mines, never were going to live in Old Mines, who were signing this petition. And it goes on for a really long time. If you ever want to drive yourself insane, read land grants of Missouri in the early 1800s. It is fascinating and confusing and frustrating all at the same time. And this is actually in the American State Papers, and it's interesting, it has never been, it was not translated. Most of the documents in French and Spanish too are translated, but this one is not, so I'll give you a rough, this was a follow-up message written in St. Genevieve in 1803. The actual petition with the valet names was written in St. Genevieve. And this was a follow-up saying, hey, by the way, as all these discussions are taking place, don't forget us, and saying the inhabitants who have signed below have the honor of reiterating to you, repeating to you, their desires and letting you know that this same concession was promised by your predecessors for years, and the only thing they're guilty of is having confidence that these promises would be kept. It's very sort of like, we're going to make you feel guilty. And this can be attested by our very dignified Commander Don Francois Valley. And I left this off the slide. It is signed Don Francois Valley. He wrote it. Which I find absolutely fascinating. And I guess this would have been just before his death, because he died 1804. Thankfully, and I think without him, this would not have been successful petition. But this is what it took for the inhabitants of Old Mines to finally, and it would be 30 years, it would be 1832, I believe, when finally the state of Missouri decides that we're finally going to approve this grant. There were many, many discussions over the years. There's even testimony from the first priest, Father Boulier of Old Mines, and in the early 1830s, where he basically begs, please, these people have been here a long time, they're good, hardworking people, and please allow this grant to be approved. And so it was a very, very long, drawn-out process. What's fascinating, and this is an entirely different topic, let me check my time, oh, I'm really good, is the fact that when the concession was first, there was a concession. We know where it is. You look at a map. You can even today kind of tell where the concession was. And so the people of Old Mines were already living there. And so when they did the concession, it was drawn into 31 very narrow strips for the 31 petitioners. And there was a random drawing saying, okay, you get number 31, you get number 16, which did not take into account in any way whatsoever where the people were living in the concession. And so what happened is like, okay, I got concession 28. Who wants to buy this? I don't really want it. I'm living on concession 5, which, with, I don't know, the Boyers or the Colemans or somebody, and I'm not moving. Because the lead's here, my family's here, my relatives are here, so yeah, give me the land. So what they found, by the time we get to the 1830s, most of the concessions have been sold and recirculated, and it makes for quite a mess, because you have, here are the original petitioners, and then pages and pages of, well, they sold it to this person, and then this person sold it to this person, and then you have the whole story of John Smith T, and it's extremely complicated. But what's fascinating is that as soon as they were given this concession, even though it wasn't approved yet, life did not change. They didn't say, ooh, I've got this land, I'm going to do good stuff on it. And they started, if we go back to that list, they started tattling on each other. There are many, many pages in the American State Papers where somebody comes and says, well, he never lived here. He had somebody come up here and pretend to live here, so it looked like somebody was living here, so that would justify the concession, but in fact, he never did. Amable Partenay, who, I think this is a mistake, he's actually listed twice here with 2 different spellings of his name, although French, was detested by the people of Old Mines, because both in Mina Breton and in Old Mines, he was accused of polluting the creek with his mining operations. So he's not a popular person, but he had money, I guess, and got his concession too. But yeah, there's a lot of testimony of, oh, he's been here for years. Yeah, he's been growing crops, and yeah, very well established. So you could tell who was legitimate and who wasn't, and who liked whom by reading through these papers. Another connection, so we've talked about the history connection, the geography connection, the mining and business connection, and there's a strong religious connection too. That's just an interesting quote from Brackenridge, who obviously the St. Genevieve connection, but who also was familiar with the mining areas. And it's interesting because following up on how only the bad people came in mind, he writes how the manners of the workmen and of the persons engaged in the mining business have been represented as barbarous in the extreme. There was one surveyor from St. Louis who came to do one survey, and he was chased off by the miners because they threatened to kill him. I am told that a few years ago there was a collection of worthless and abandoned characters, and that the different mines were scenes of brawls and savage ferocity, but the state of society has greatly altered since that time. So things have calmed down a little bit since the initial battles over the land grants in particular. There has been some very atrocious acts committed lately, but it would be unfair to infer from these the general character of those engaged about the mines. There are many worthy and reputable men engaged in this business, and many respectable families are scattered through the mine country. Yeah, it was barbarous, but now there are only occasional atrocious acts. So, I guess it's all relative. But I want to move on to another connection, which is the religious connection between the two communities. And in particular, Father Henri Pratt, who on a couple of occasions writes to his superior to talk about the fact that he is going to Old Mines to minister to the population there. To him is also attributed the first church at Old Mines, which would have been a log church, probably very close to or next to the church that is there today, which was consecrated in the early 1830s. During his brief career, he was in Old Mines on a regular basis. Also, the name Pratt is also, so he was from St. Genevieve, and he undoubtedly had a connection through family ties to the Old Mines community. And it's interesting, you read some of the older articles, and it's like he built the first church, and I can just see the priest going up and grabbing the logs, and just like Father Boulier is credited as building the first church, and it's like, okay, you have to think somewhat metaphorically about these things. And of course, without diving too deeply into this in the few minutes I have left, I wanted to some family connections. And just scratching the surface in referring to some of the families. If you look at this list, you see the Kuhlmann originally. Frank Kuhlmann, who came from was now Germany, marrying in 1774. His son, Ray Kola, there's a community called Ray Kola north of Old Mines proper, marrying a Boyer marrying Duclos, marrying an Aubuchon, Porte, Robert, Beaune, Bourassa, Thibault. These are all Old Mines names. These are all marriages that are happening by couples that are going to be basically the original families of Old Mines. All of these marriages are happening in St. Genevieve. So because there's not a church yet, nor a priest at Old Mines, but these families are in St. Genevieve, and a generation later you've got family in Old Mines. And you see you've got the families whose names split. You've got the Roberts who become Polites, so you've got Robert, Polites, and a rabbit hole I'm not going down into. And then you have names that have changed, so the Beaune, or B-A-U-L-N-E, is Beaune today. The Duclos, or the Duclos, and of course that's a name that goes far back. And then I go to the next slide, looking at names found in the St. Genevieve census, 1830 and 1850, and the parish records of the 19th century of Old Mines. And the church at Old Mines is St. Joachim, and that's another connection between the two communities. While you look at these names, and they're Old Mine names, but they're names that also have a very strong connection to St. Genevieve. You have Aubuchon with various spellings, Becket was with Renault coming over to mine, and he died in, I don't know if it was San Felipe or Kaskaskia, in the early, in 1740s, I believe, but the family's still there. Of course, the Boyer, you can see, you can pronounce that last name two ways.
Who?
Boyer.
Well,
Boyer or Boyer?
When I was born in Elvins, I was Booyer. And when I moved to St. Louis, I was promptly told I was Boyer.
Okay.
So I said, okay.
Sorry. Careful how you pronounce things. Yeah.
You can tell, south of the big river, it's Booyer.
Yeah.
Or Booyer.
Then you have the Courtois, which now is Cordaway, because it probably was pronounced Courtois in the 18th century. The Duclos or Ducluse, Govero, various spellings, La Chance. The nicknames you see, La Chance, and although it's not, I didn't see it in the St. Genevieve, Sans Souci is a very common name in Old Mines. That means no worries. So he was a carefree guy, and the last name became that. La Lumondière, La Rose, Misset, Pratt, which we have just mentioned, and so on, and Valet. So you can see that, and this is just, you could go on for a long time discussing all of these connections with the families between the two communities. But it's interesting because there's a very good work by Walter Schroeder called Opening the Ozarks, which focuses on the St. Genevieve district. And I was rereading his chapter on old mines recently as I was trying to remind myself of a few things in preparation for this talk. And it's interesting because he talks about how, although there is a strong connection, historical, familial, between Old Mines and St. Genevieve, they were very different communities. And especially over the course of time with the Americanization, you might say, of the region, the mentality, the culture of Old Mines became very much distinct and very much, I don't want to say isolated in a negative sense, but it was, in that it was an area of French speakers engaged in lead and then tiff mining, which was an activity that not many other people were doing at all, certainly not in the way that the French were doing it. And that really until the 20th century, when you have the introduction of radio, paved roads, men going off to military service, and the world becoming smaller and smaller in a way that the Old Mines community changes at all. But I continue to be fascinated by this connection between Old Mines and St. Genevieve, and just so much that we don't know. I was talking to earlier, we were talking about, well, how did they even get lead out of there in the 18th century? And well, it took a long time. It took a couple of days probably if you wanted to get a lot of it out. And go back to that original map showing Old Mines being west of here, and I was like, well, there was some kind of path that may have already existed, or that they took to get the lead out. They probably did not use the waterway, which would have been feasible perhaps, but probably not with lead. And so it's just, there's so much that we don't know. As I go through all these various aspects of the history, I realize how much information we may not ever have because of the nature of the work that was being done. It wasn't something people were writing about. They weren't writing about their lives if they knew how to write in Old Mines. So there's some aspects that we can only get in bits and pieces. And fortunately, with the records in St. Genevieve, we were able to know a lot more about Old Mines than perhaps we would otherwise. There's so much more I could say about Old Mines and St. Genevieve, but I think I'm going to leave it at that, and I hope I've at least given you an introduction to this connection, about which much more could be said. Thank you. Yes, I know you had your hand up at one point during my presentation.
With this whole, you were talking about the early 1700s with the request for concessions or land grants. So we're going to.
1800s.
Okay, 1800s. But when it came after the Louisiana Purchase, were they actually, how was that process actually conducted? Here's this kind of remote area. Who was making those determinations as to whether they got the grants for, you know, you're saying agriculture, yes, mining, probably no. But were there actually American representatives in the area?
Oh, yes, it was all being done in, as far as I can tell, I would say it's all being done in St. Louis.
So that's what I was saying. They had to send petitions up there.
Judges,
But you mentioned the one surveyor. I mean, who was actually determining whether, you know, when you say agriculture, yes, mining, no, that whether it was legitimate?
well, that's why almost all of the grants in the first decade of the 19th century were turned down. Almost all of them. It was virtually impossible because the men who were overseeing this in St. Louis saying, we have no idea what's going on, and until we do, they were even arguing between themselves. There's some interesting letters in the American State Papers where one judge says, don't trust what this judge is saying because he's in with the valleys and he's going to approve whatever they say they want to approve. And so there are volumes and volumes, big, thick volumes.
But the petitions had to be sent to St. Louis probably.
Yeah, I think everything was
The
being
bureaucracy
done,
was
being
there.
looked at in St. Louis.
Thank you.
There's a thing called the Hunt Minutes, which is about 1827, which deals with a lot of these properties, and it's the rationale why they're either accepted or not accepted. And I think those, I can't remember what Hunt's first name, because we've got two Hunts here. That's an important document.
Thank you.
You're right, the legend here is somebody said that his neighbor had planted corn in the spring. And the legend is that he put a corn stalk in the spring. Nowadays,
Wasn't it Theodore?
yes, Theodore.
Yes.
Did the French and Spanish government buy a lot of this lead for their soldiers, or what was done with it?
Most of the lead, I believe, was shipped down to New Orleans. I don't know, now Austin or builds the first tower to make shot at Herculaneum in the years after, I guess it's the first decade of the 19th century. But otherwise, they were not processing the lead for use. Maybe they couldn't have been using lead. Lead was used a lot for seals.
I'm sorry, for what?
For seals, like to seal packages.
Yeah.
I assume that was not a very elaborate process. That probably could have been done here, but there are a lot of records of lead being shipped to New Orleans. Where it went from there, or if it was processed there, or shot with it, or where it was sent down.
There were a lot of hunters in the area. They didn't make bullets out of it?
They would make shot, yeah, shot would have been made. I don't know if they were making primitive shot here.
Well, that's what I was talking about, the garrison use.
Definitely, under the French and Spanish, I don't know. I don't know enough weaponry to know how shot is made, except that I know that at Herculaneum, Austin builds a shot tower because they would drop lead because that's how they.
There's no evidence of exporting it abroad or anything like that, right?
Not that there probably was, but I don't know enough about that aspect of the lead.
I think our records, you can find lead going down the river on both manifests here, and payment of stuff in lead was very common.
Was this in
Oh,
the
yes, it was a,
18th century bomb, or?
Yeah.
yes, it was a currency.
I mean, Valet, Carl and I were looking at a document, the Valet had a boat, he's had several boats that went down the river, but sometimes lead would be included.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Who was the author of the book, Opening the Ozarks?
Walter Schroeder, Schroede. I have to go back, I don't know if maybe he had, at the time that one was done, which was not the original, maybe he had already bought a concession from somebody, but I'll have to go back and look. Maybe that's just could be an error in the record, since the last name spelled two different ways, some English guy says, I don't know who this French people are. That's a different person. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.